In January of 1802, President Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to a religious group known as the Danbury Baptists. The group had contacted Jefferson because they had some concerns about the possibility that the United States government would sanction an official religion for the country. And so Jefferson wrote them a letter in response. And in the letter he wrote, and it's a little cumbersome, so just please bear with me, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that the act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. If you've ever heard that phrase before, that's where it comes from, the separation of church and state. And so the point that Jefferson was making in his letter to the Baptists is that there was not going to be an official sanctioned religion by the United States government for the country. In our gospel today, Jesus reaffirms that we have a duty to be obedient to legitimate civil authorities. The Pharisees were attempting to trap him with this question on taxes, and so they ask him, "Teacher, what do you think about paying the census tax?" Now, it's a trap because many of the Jews believed that paying the tax was actually reinforcing the tyranny of the Romans. And so if Jesus were to support paying the tax, he would be seen as siding with the Roman government, and it would discredit him among his own Jewish people. If he were to oppose paying the tax, he could then be accused of being critical of the Roman authorities. But true to form, Jesus gives the Pharisees an answer that they probably weren't expecting. He does not give them a yes or no, but rather he gives them a two-part response. In the first part of his response, Jesus tells them, "Repay to Caesar what belongs to Caesar." It's as if to say, give Caesar what is rightly his, tribute and obedience to laws that are just, but nothing more. What this means for us today in our 21st century America is that we should give back to society in some way, obey laws that are just, pay taxes, and participate in community service. In other words, be a dependable and loyal citizen. This is being patriotic, and as Catholics, we should be some of the most patriotic citizens in the country. Now, at the same time, our civil authorities have an obligation and a responsibility to act justly and to serve the common good without concern for their own personal interests. As Christians, it's also important that we pray for those who hold public office and those who exercise civil authority. Now, in the second part of his answer, Jesus tells the Pharisees, "Repay to God what belongs to God." You see, we as Christians have citizenship here on earth, but we also have citizenship in heaven. By our baptism, we were made citizens of the heavenly city. And so while we do owe something to the state, we do owe something to society, we most certainly owe something to God. And so giving to God what belongs to God means following the example of Christ, following the commandments, being compassionate, being forgiving, looking out for the poor and most vulnerable in our society. Sometimes following the example of Christ means that we stand up for certain moral values in the face of being unpopular or in the face of being called intolerant. You know, it's very interesting that the church can sometimes be accused of being political when we take stands on issues that are in the public arena. Some try to say that the church shouldn't be involved in public policy discussions, and they'll cite Jefferson's letter, this separation of church and state. But this isn't what Jefferson meant when he wrote to the Baptists. In fact, there is a quote on the Jefferson Memorial. Now, I'm paraphrasing this a little bit, but it essentially reads that our freedoms come from God, and it's important that we recognize our freedoms come from God. And when a society discounts that, when a society pretends that that is not the case, then the society is doomed. So Jefferson never intended that religion, that God not be part of the public discussion. And it certainly wasn't the intention of Jesus for religion to be limited within the walls of the church or within the walls of our homes. Quite the opposite. As Christians, we are meant to be salt of the earth and light of the world, and we are called to transform the societies and environments where we live and where we work. And so what we believe as Catholics, the moral fabric of our faith, is very relevant to public policy discussions in our country. Now, this is not the same thing as pushing our religious values on others. For example, we're not going to insist that a law be passed that requires everyone to believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. That would be an example of trying to force our religious values on others. No, if we stop and think about it, the goals of the state and the goals of the church should be very similar. Protect human life, pay workers a just wage, defend and give aid to poor and most vulnerable among us. To sum it all up, to promote the common good. When we are advocates for the common good of all persons, made in the image and likeness of God, this is not the church getting involved in politics. Rather, it is following Christ's instructions that we hear today in the gospel, to give Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to give God what belongs to God.